this session each afternoon at 2 p.m. session, we're going to shift our attention to what's called the compassion wing of practice. And the reason is that if we are only doing mindfulness practice, i.e. only doing either shamatha practice or vipassana practice, we can become quite self-absorbed and maybe find ourselves quite disconnected from the world. Because this practice, particularly shamatha practice, is a practice to calm the mind. So in that practice there's a danger that we use that practice as a way of withdrawing from all that mess out there. So we sort of withdraw into our own little bubble of peace. And that's not a very healthy place to go, because we end up becoming very disconnected from everyone, even to the point of being insensitive to the sufferings of others. So we need to stay connected. So therefore we are going to look at this compassion wing of practice in the 2 p.m. session to practice that connection, to stay connected. And also we'll find that this practice gives us a healthy basis and motivation for doing the shamatha and vipassana practice. So today we're going to look at the loving kindness practice. And loving kindness in Sanskrit is Maitri, in Pali, metta. And loving kindness is simply the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Sometimes the word Maitri and metta is translated as love, but I think that can be a bit misleading, because usually love in the English language is understood to be an emotion, and often it implies some sort of intimate behavior. Whereas here, loving kindness or Maitri Metta is not an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's a wish. It's an aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So therefore, it's probably better to translate Maitri and Metta as loving kindness rather than love. Now, most of us already, of course, have an aspiration to be happy. But often that aspiration is misdirected, meaning that not only don't we tend to find happiness, but sometimes even we induce even more suffering. And this is very nicely summarized by great Indian master Shantideva from the 8th century. He says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So if we really want to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves and others, then it would be helpful to know, what do we mean by happiness, and what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes? So when we say happiness, what do we mean by happiness? We can talk about two types of happiness. We can talk about temporal happiness and genuine happiness. Temporal happiness is another name for pleasure, our pleasurable experiences. These pleasurable experiences, of course, are stimulus-based happiness. We have a certain stimulus, we have a pleasurable experience. And so since it's a stimulus-based happiness, it's often called conditioned happiness, meaning we need certain conditions to have this experience. And so since it's conditioned happiness, it's by nature transient or temporary, meaning you have a stimulus, you have a pleasant experience, stimulus finishes, happiness experience finishes. And since it's a stimulus-based happiness, it's also unreliable, meaning we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasurable experience whenever we want one. It requires a certain stimulus. If the stimulus is not there, no pleasurable experience. And if we look closely at our pleasurable experiences, we'll come to realize they're actually not even in the nature of happiness. Because if pleasurable experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience is that if we often overindulge in our pleasurable experiences, not only don't they make us more happy, often they induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. For example, eating too much of our favourite chocolate cake, or spending too long out in the nice warm sunshine. So therefore we can understand these pleasurable experiences are relative experiences. Relative to a previous state they're an improvement, but if we overindulge in them, they often turn into suffering themselves. And then we have genuine happiness. And genuine happiness is simply a state of inner well-being that does not require any particular stimulus to be present. So it's not a stimulus-based happiness, therefore it's what's called unconditioned happiness. It doesn't require certain conditions for it to be present. It's simply a state of inner well-being that comes about through being in harmony with the nature of reality. So when we are talking about cultivating loving kindness for ourselves and others, the main thing we're focusing on, of course, is genuine happiness, inner well-being. Now, of course, what we tend to do is we conflate those two, meaning that we think or hope that our pleasurable experiences are going to satisfy us and fulfill us. And all that does is it leads to a lot of unnecessary suffering. Because then we end up simply with craving and attachment to our pleasurable experiences, hoping that they're going to fulfill us and hoping that they don't finish and hoping we get more of them. And of course, then that craving and attachment often leads to worry and anxiety about not getting those things, frustration when we don't get them, often then overindulging when we do get them, which causes more suffering, and then often it leads to dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. And then of course that craving and attachment is never satisfied, because craving and attachment is always looking for something bigger, better and different. Which means if we get too much of something we like, after not a very long time, craving and attachment will say, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I want something bigger, better, and different. Which means we end up not enjoying the things we used to, because now craving and attachment says that's not good enough anymore. So if we can identify that there are these two types of happiness and not conflate them and not hope that temporal happiness is going to give us some inner well-being, then we can strive for this state of genuine happiness, and at the same time we will enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more than we do now, because we'll be able to let go of craving and attachment to them, because we'll realize they're never going to fulfill us. So then, if we are striving for genuine happiness, loving kindness is the wish for happiness and its causes. So therefore, we need to know what are the causes of genuine happiness. And as we already briefly saw yesterday, there are three main causes: ethics, concentration, wisdom. That on the basis of an ethical lifestyle, we engage in the concentration practice, or in other words, the shamatha practice, and then on that basis, we engage in the wisdom practice, or in other words, vipassana practice, to come to realize the nature of reality. Thereby, we can overcome our distorted view of reality, thereby overcome all of our mental afflictions and suffering, and find that state of genuine happiness or inner well-being in being in harmony with the nature of reality. So then, if we understand these two types of happiness, and we understand what are the causes for genuine happiness, then when we develop loving kindness for ourselves and others, then this wish or aspiration for happiness and its causes won't merely be words that don't have any meaning. In fact, when we develop that aspiration for happiness and its causes, then we will strive to produce the causes of happiness for ourselves, and then we'll try to help others also do likewise. Now, in practicing this loving kindness, generally in the meditation text, it says we should do this in a number of stages. Usually 4 stages are mentioned. The first is that we cultivate loving kindness first to our friends, because it's most easy. Once we're comfortable with that, then we expand it out to include people we don't know very well, so-called strangers. Once we're comfortable with that, we expand out to the so-called enemy, the difficult person. And then we expand out to all living beings. So we do those 4 stages. But I think in our modern society, we probably need to add one more step at the beginning that normally is not mentioned in the meditation texts, and that is to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves first. I think historically people generally felt okay about themselves, but unfortunately in our modern society that's often not the case. Often we don't feel very good about ourselves, even have low self-esteem and even self-hatred sometimes. So if we're not feeling good about ourselves, if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, we're not going to be able to expand that out to others. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to do a loving kindness meditation in those stages, starting with ourselves first. Before we do that meditation, is there any questions about anything I've mentioned so far? Okay. Oh.
After Buddha taking loving kindness to the one who close to us, neutral and enemies. What do we add in the fourth stage, or sentient being?
Right. The first three categories are really towards people that we really come into contact with. So I think the fourth one is just a complete category, you know, that not to miss out anyone. And those first three usually we do to specific people in those categories, where the fourth one is towards all. And I think for the fourth category, towards all living beings, I mean, it's easy to say, you know, I have loving kindness towards all living beings, and often that doesn't have much impact. And so I think in a practical sense, what loving kindness towards all living beings means, basically to have loving kindness towards everyone we come into contact with. I think this is a practical way of implementing the fourth one, so that it's not just some vague word, because it's easy to say that, but often it doesn't have any impact just saying that, because we're not being specific. So that's a way of being specific.
Human beings is not sentient beings?
Yeah, so sentient beings, yeah, living beings. So, of course, initially we can start with humans, and then we can expand out, including animals and so forth.
How do you explain this difference? Why in our world, in the Western world, we need to do loving kindness for ourselves? I mean, it's a big question, but...
I'm going to touch on that tomorrow afternoon when we look at the compassion practice. So I think you'll get hopefully a good answer tomorrow afternoon. Okay, let's do the meditation, and then after the meditation I'd like to talk a little bit about attachment and the difference between attachment and loving kindness, because often there's a lot of confusion. But first, the meditation. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body. Simply becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Loving kindness is the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And we can begin by cultivating loving kindness toward ourselves and then expanding that out to others. Now, no matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind, in other words, no matter how much anger, jealousy, craving, anxiety, and so forth are in our minds, these mental afflictions are not part of the nature of our mind. They are merely covering the surface of our mind. And beneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our minds. So imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest, at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling your entire body and mind. Imagining it transforms into everything you need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to be happy in the short term and the long term. imagine you've now found the genuine happiness that you seek. And simply rest in that state of inner well-being. Next, bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one. And picture them very clearly in front of you. Again, arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness and its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from your heart, filling and saturating their entire body and mind, and transforming into everything they need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And then imagine that they've now found that state of inner well-being and happiness. And take delight in this. And then allow your field of loving kindness to expand out to the person seated next to you. They are just like yourself in wanting to be happy. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness in its causes. May you be truly well and happy. Again, with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling their entire body and mind, and transforming into everything they need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. In the short term and the long term. And imagine that they've now found the genuine happiness that they seek. And rejoice in this. And then allow your field of loving kindness to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's a friend, stranger, or even a difficult person, attend to them. May you be truly well and happy. And breathing out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. Allow your mind to continue to move around, and whoever comes to mind, breathing out the light of loving kindness. what I'd like to do now is have a look at attachment.
I found this meditation a little bit difficult for me because I felt there is a contradiction between some basic assumptions of mine. Because I think that those negative aspects of us, those attachment impulse, and all those things are part of us. And the way to deal with them is by being in dialogue with them, to embrace them, and not to see ourselves as pure and that not part of us. Or maybe I didn't understand right. So it was.
So
I mean,
yeah.
for.
There are, of course, many theories about mental afflictions such as attachment, anger, jealousy, and so forth. And I think many of the modern theories seem to be similar in that that is the basic human nature. You're stuck with them. You better get used to them. Okay, maybe you can do something to reduce them a bit, but you're stuck with them. And I think most modern theories would say that. Whereas Buddhism would say that yes, some of them can be very strong habits, but they're not part of the nature of the mind. Meaning we can eliminate them because the Buddhist assertion is that they are there because of a distorted view of reality. And so this is a little bit what we're looking at here, particularly in the Vipassana, the wisdom practice, and we're going to look at this a bit more tomorrow in terms of compassion, is that the Buddhist assertion is that we can eliminate these mental afflictions 100% from our mind. So when we're talking here that they're not part of the nature of the mind, it's not somehow doing this. Because doing this or doing this both create problems. What we want to do, of course, is confront the mental afflictions without doing this or doing this, attachment or aversion. Because both of those just magnify problems and suffering. So, and this is what we're going to look at tomorrow in the shamatha practice when we go to look at the mind. And this is another one of the benefits of using the mind as the object of focus for our shamatha practice, is that when these mental afflictions arise, instead of getting caught up in them and having problems, and instead of trying to suppress them, we can simply be present with them and observe them as they arise and pass. So already the shamatha practice is going to help us to effectively work with those mental afflictions, to reduce them. But if we want to get rid of them 100%, we need to do more than that. We need to look at the underlying cause, and the underlying cause, according to Buddhism, is a distorted view of reality. And so we're going to start to touch on that very briefly on Friday, Saturday, when we look at this Vipassana practice. So actually, when we talk about loving kindness and particularly compassion, if we believe and accept that the mental afflictions are part of the nature of the mind, and that's it, we're stuck with them, then actually it becomes difficult to develop loving kindness or compassion, because while they're in our mind, it's a bit difficult to have well-being as long as mental afflictions in our mind. It's a bit difficult to have freedom from suffering if we have mental afflictions. So then loving kindness and compassion, as they're presented here, very difficult to cultivate, because if we have the assumption that we've got mental afflictions, we're stuck with them, that's it, then it would be difficult. So this is what we are, this loving kindness and compassion, as here we're presenting it, of course, are part of the Buddhist framework, and part of that framework is this understanding that mental afflictions are not part of the nature of the mind. And so we introduce that idea here in this meditation because often in our modern society we identify with our mental afflictions. And this is a topic I'm going to talk a little bit more about tomorrow afternoon. And as long as we identify with our mental afflictions, we're in trouble because they take hold of us. We're dominated by the mental afflictions. We're overwhelmed by mental afflictions. And that's often leading us to engage in behavior which we later regret. So does that make any sense?
I don't agree with Bob that.
Sure. Sure. And of course, this is...
I think that you can